All right, let's dive into this and contrast Kinect with Sony's experiments, like PS Move, PSVR, and other gimmicks. Because while both companies dabbled in new ideas, their approaches couldn't be more different. Microsoft's Kinect became a cautionary tale, while Sony's ventures, even when they didn't fully succeed, never alienated their audience. Let's unpack why. Sony's gimmicks, experiments, not obligations. The key difference between Sony's approach and Microsoft's with Kinect is this. Sony's experiments were always optional. When they introduced the PS Move or PSVR, they treated them like side dishes, not the main course. These were products you could explore if they interested you, but they weren't essential to enjoying the PlayStation experience. Take PS Move, for example. It came out during the motion control craze sparked by the Wii. Did Sony push it as the future of gaming? Not really. It was a response to a trend, but it never overshadowed the core PlayStation identity. Even with PSVR, Sony leaned into its experimental nature, but kept it separate from the main console experience. It wasn't, you need this to play PlayStation games. It was, hey, this is something cool we're trying. Want to check it out? That's where Microsoft dropped the ball with Kinect. By bundling it with the Xbox One and tying it so deeply into the console's functionality, Microsoft made it a requirement. They were essentially saying, this is how you'll play now, whether you like it or not. It's like Sony offering you VR goggles while Microsoft straps them to your face and says, this is the future. Deal with it. Sony always kept their focus on what made PlayStation great, incredible games. Even as they launched things like PS Move and PSVR, they didn't let those experiments distract from their core mission. Titles like Uncharted, The Last of Us, God of War, and Spider-Man were the heart of the PlayStation brand. Whether you cared about motion controls or VR didn't matter. Those big story-driven games were always front and center. Microsoft, meanwhile, seemed to lose focus. During the Kinect era, they started pitching the Xbox as a multimedia hub instead of a gaming console. It wasn't just about the games anymore. It was about watching TV, controlling your cable box, and using voice commands to navigate menus. The Kinect became a symbol of that shift, and players noticed. It felt like Microsoft was more interested in selling an ecosystem than making great games. Compare that to Sony, who never let their experiments overshadow their core identity as a gaming-first platform. The role of games in success or failure. Let's talk about the games, because this is where the contrast becomes glaring. The Kinect never had a killer app, a game that made people say, wow, I need this device. Sure, there were some fitness games and party titles, but nothing that truly justified its existence. Most games felt like they were shoehorning Kinect features in, making the experience awkward rather than enhancing it. Sony, on the other hand, approached their experiments differently. Even though PS Move didn't dominate, it had games like Sports Champions and Little Big Planet that made decent use of it. And with PSVR, Sony leaned into exclusives like Astrobot Rescue Mission, Blood and Truth, and Resident Evil 7 in VR mode. These weren't just gimmicks. They were thoughtful integrations that made the technology feel worthwhile for those who chose to invest in it. Respecting the player's choice. One of the smartest things Sony did was give players the freedom to ignore their gimmicks. Didn't care about PSVR? No problem. You could still enjoy the best PlayStation games without ever touching a headset. Didn't buy into PS Move? That's fine. Those controllers weren't required for anything major. With Kinect, Microsoft took the opposite approach. They bundled it with the Xbox One, jacking up the price of the console, and made it a mandatory part of the experience. It wasn't just a fun option. It was a feature you had to deal with whether you wanted it or not. That approach backfired hard. Players resented paying extra for a device they didn't want, and the mandatory nature of Kinect made it feel more like an obligation than an innovation. Sony's handling of its studios also played a huge role in the success of their experiments versus Microsoft's struggles. Sony allowed their studios to experiment without sacrificing their core strengths. Naughty Dog, Santa Monica Studio, and Insomniac continued to deliver masterpieces, even as Sony dabbled in motion controls or VR. The experiments were separate ventures, and the studios weren't forced to incorporate them into their games unless it made sense creatively. Microsoft, on the other hand, seemed to push Kinect into places it didn't belong. Even flagship games like Halo and Fable had Kinect features tacked on, often to their detriment. It felt like Microsoft was forcing their developers to bend their creative vision to accommodate a device that didn't really add anything meaningful. That kind of micromanagement stifled creativity, and over time, it hurt the brand. They lost key talent, like the original Halo developers at Bungie, because they didn't know how to let their teams thrive. Sony, meanwhile, retained its top studios and allowed them the freedom to focus on what they did best, making incredible games. Another big reason Kinect failed? Microsoft's obsession with integrating everything into their ecosystem. They wanted the Xbox to tie seamlessly into Windows, into your cable box, into your entire living room setup. But in doing so, they lost sight of what gamers actually wanted. The Kinect became more about controlling Netflix or yelling at your Xbox to turn on than about enhancing the gaming experience. Sony, in contrast, never let their experiments muddy their message. PlayStation was, and still is, about the games. Even their side projects like PSVR were designed to complement the gaming experience, not replace it. Sony knew where to draw the line, and that respect for the player's experience is a big reason why their gimmicks never became failures like Kinect did.